Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you are joining us. We are privileged to have Dr. Randy Richards with us today. He is provost at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He's also a renowned New Testament scholar. I'll give you that adjective.
Well,
for
my
sure.
mom will appreciate it.
Author of several books. He's going to talk about a couple of those even today, and we're really glad you're here with us. But let's start with first things first. Who's your barber during coronavirus? Because Jordan and I are really in need of someone to give us a trim, and you look like you've been very well kept.
It is Stacia. And so she learned to cut my hair, actually, while we were on the mission field.
Oh, very good. That's great. That's a great segue.
That was the
into,
best unintentional
it
segue
was.
we've had
Ever.
in this.
100% our best
Yes.
segue.
So we're continuing a little series on exploring what effect does contextual theology have on understanding a global perspective on Christianity. And Dr. Richards, Provost Richards, has an incredible depth of experience and knowledge of life overseas. Can you tell us just a little bit of biographical detail about where you were overseas and what led you to, or what drew you to take the step to the mission field?
Stacia and I were called to missions.
Mm-hmm.
And so when our oldest son Josh was 2 and our younger son Jacob was 8 weeks old, we got on a plane, and a mere 56 hours later, we got off a plane in Java, Jakarta, Java, Indonesia. From there, we actually studied the language there for nearly a year. And then we went 1,500 miles east to an island between Borneo and New Guinea, an island called Sulawesi. And there we worked with a wonderful group of people. It didn't take me very long to realize the best job I could do is don't mess anything up. And so they were running a great little Bible school there. And so my job was to help them kind of upgrade, get accredited. We then launched 2 other schools, started a master's program. But they're just a wonderful group of people, friends to this day.
Beautiful. Had you had much international experience before going off to the mission field?
I had traveled, but kind of the U.S. sort of person experience where
Sure.
you go somewhere. And,
Yeah.
and as a boy, I lived on Okinawa for a year, but
Oh,
was
wow.
part of the military.
Huh.
So, there wasn't a lot of contextual experience there.
Wow. Huh.
That's great. And so tell us, just to sort of whet our appetites about your experience in Indonesia, give us a story that stands out. If you're at a party, this is the one story you're going to tell about your time in Indonesia.
Oh, I'm terrible about that sort of thing, so I'll tell a story.
All right, good.
At one point, some of my students had come from Papua, from the interior, which is a very remote area, actually had no contact with the outside world before the 1950s, because it's a valley, a famous valley, Balim Valley, completely surrounded by high mountains, so there's no land route in. And so eventually, a couple of Australian missionaries got a plane as high as you can fly. There's a mountain pass you can fly through. They landed. They were killed and eaten. But then the next 2, who were a little, they're actually the really brave ones, they got in a plane, landed on the other end of the valley, and started mission work there. And when I visited in the early 90s, there were about 70,000 Christians in that valley.
Wow.
So wonderful group of people, very interesting group of people. They say we're no longer cannibals because we don't think Jesus would like that. And I thought, I can't think of a verse really, but I'm going to go with it. I said, yes, he definitely would
That
not
seems
like
consistent with Jesus'
Yeah.
ethic. Yeah,
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. I love that. Well, so we have, over the last few weeks, been talking about contextual theology. And we've mentioned several times your book, Misreading Scripture with
This
Western
one.
Eyes. Yeah, give us a little show and tell.
The first person to view this and leave a comment will get a signed copy by Dr. Richards.
Wow. Okay. I'd be
Good one,
honored.
Jordan. That's amazing. So we've mentioned the book several times, just to say, like, there are good anecdotes in here. That you're a great storyteller, and I love some of the stories that we get in this book, just by way of telling or demonstrating to us that we read the Bible with Western eyes,
Right.
almost inevitably. But then, how can we guard against that in the ways where we see it being a negative thing? What were some of the experiences you had that brought you to writing this book and that went into writing this
Right. Let me do a preface first by saying someone could write a book, Misreading Scripture with Eastern Eyes. It would be a great book. I can't write it, but it'd be a great book. So this is not a book that bashes the West. I think the church has been blessed by the West, but every culture has certain cultural lenses that cause us to misread. And since I came from the West, I wrote this one.
Right.
So the way I learned it, I remember vividly the first time it occurred to me that perhaps things aren't the way that I thought. I was visiting a church way up in the interior, and they were they had an issue, and I could tell they didn't want to talk to me about it. But then they also wanted my opinion, and so they said, Pastor, we have a couple that's moved to our village. They moved here about 10 years ago. They had committed a grievous sin in their previous village. And so they came to ours, but they have been living wonderful, godly lives here ever since, and they'd like to join our church. Do you think it'd be okay? And I said, well, I don't see why not. You know, they've been living great lives. They said, oh, yes, wonderful lives, but it was a very, very serious sin. I said, well, I'm not sure I can. I'm thinking axe murderer, you know. So I said,
You're gonna have to tell me a little bit about
yeah.
the sin.
And so that's what I said, and I could tell they didn't want to,
Right.
you know, to really air the dirty laundry from the village. But I finally said, you know, I really can't help you. And they said, well, they married on the run, which is what we call elopement.
Huh.
And I said, what's the sin? And they looked at me kind of
Right.
confused, and they said, have you never read Paul? And I thought, well, I have a PhD in Paul, you know.
Surely my answer should be
Yeah.
yes, but
I said, what do you mean? They said, well, Paul says, children, obey your parents. And, you know, we know they don't always obey their parents, but in the most important decision in their life, surely they should obey their parents. And I realized for me, that verse in Ephesians 6 had an expiration date. You know, it meant until age 18.
right.
And of course, Paul wasn't writing to children when he wrote the letter to the Ephesians. And that was my first hint that maybe the Paul I was reading might not match exactly the Paul in the
It's interesting you mentioned that. When we filmed with Dr. Fairclough, he talked similarly about how dynamics between Thai students becoming Christians and having to go back to their parents on their knees, prostrate, asking for forgiveness for the shame they brought on them. So
Right.
So I have another story that kind of brought to mind.
Yeah.
I was a teacher, so I had done a test, you know, a multiple choice test, and I had scored them, and I'm passing them out. I remember this one. And I hand the exam to a student. As I did, I looked at the front, you know, the first page, and they had gotten one question wrong because they had not answered it. And I said, well, you didn't answer that question. They said, no, I didn't know the answer. I said, well, you should have guessed. And the student looked appalled and said, but what if I got it right? It would imply that I knew the answer when I didn't, and that would be lying. And
Wow.
I started to talk about probabilities, and I realized, wait a minute, I'm about to argue them to a lower standard. And that's when it occurred to me, when I pondered it later that day, that my American pragmatism, because it does work, at least some of the time,
Sure.
my American pragmatism was overriding my Christian view of truth. Now, when I tell that story to my students here, they hate it because they want to be able to keep guessing answers, but they have a suspicion that probably my Indonesian student was right.
Right. Yeah. I love that idea. I find in situations where there is a cultural context at play, we can find ourselves so often arguing someone to a lower standard based on our own cultural assumptions. And I love that you put it that way. That's really helpful. Okay, so related to misreading Scripture with Western eyes and your experiences that went into writing that book, how have your experiences shaped your own theology? What do you feel like you brought back from the mission field and have put into practice in your American context?
Great question. One of the things I did early on was I started realizing there were certain assumptions that I grew up with that went unquestioned, like pragmatism, newness, you know, anything new. You know, if you're a youth minister, you walk into a group of kids, we're going to do something new. Well, they're already excited. They don't even know what it is. They don't know if it's better or not. But the fact that it's new is automatically better. And in the East, usually, new is not necessarily, it's unproven. You know, time-tested, old is actually, so it's interesting, the writer of Hebrews has to try to explain that the gospel isn't really new, because new would not be good. So they
Right.
have to say, really, this is the old thing. It's just, in ages past, God spoke this way, but now he's speaking this way. So their rule was pastors must be male. So I show up to speak. There's about 100 people in the room, and there's about a dozen women in the room. So I finish speaking, sit down next to Yoti, the head of the convention. And I said, so I thought only pastors were coming. Yep, only pastors came, he said. So everyone in this room is a pastor. Yep. They're all called pastor. Yeah. So I should have left it alone, but I'm an American. I can't do that. So I said, but some of them are women. Yeah. And they're pastors. Yeah. Should have left it alone there. But I said, but your bylaws say pastors must be male. Then he said, yes, and most of them are.
And is that where you decided to leave it? Or
Well, I thought about it a long
conversation go
time
further?
because what it says is they have a different view of rules than we do.
Okay.
For them, well, for us, I got to thinking, as an American, as a Westerner, probably, because it's probably true in Scotland too, a rule has to apply to everyone or it's not fair.
Right.
And a rule has to apply all the time or it's broken. And since God is always fair and never broken, then his rules have to apply all the time. And yet Scripture is full of exceptions, but we just ignore them. So Joshua takes the children of Israel into the promised land. Okay, Israelites get land, Canaanites don't get land. First story is a Canaanite that gets land, and the second story is an Israelite who doesn't. I mean, in the East, the job of the head of the office is to make the exceptions. If you're just following the rules, that's what the workers do. But the head of the office is there to make the exceptions. And yet we read, and so, when Paul, I think if we interviewed Paul and we said, Paul, you said women are not allowed to teach. He'd say, no, they're not. We said, but what about Phoebe? Oh, yeah, sure, Phoebe. And for us, we can't do that. But the problem is not that there's a problem with Scripture or the way that we read it. I think we're taking our understanding of rules to Scripture.
Wow. Yeah. I've never thought about it that way.
So God predestines everything he wants to.
Right.
But, and this is what drives me crazy. Sorry, all you Calvinists. I think one of the perks of being sovereign is you get to do whatever you want.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, because you mentioned our Calvinist friends. I was going to ask if our theologians on faculty would say that's like a little too cute by half. Is it a little bit too neat to be able to say that? Can we not say something further? I'm just curious.
I
Really,
think
it's off the
that
top of my
it
head.
is so interesting to me that Indonesians, my Indonesian pastor friends who were well educated, had no trouble with God predestining everything and then not some things.
Right.
And I would say, but how can you say he didn't predestine this part? They would say, well, he's God. He gets to pick what he wants.
Yeah.
But we build a system where even God is not sovereign over the system.
Sure. And we make the system sovereign over God.
It's like our understanding of God defines the system,
Yes,
and we can't fit it beyond that.
right. So scriptures that don't fit have to be jettisoned.
We just don't talk about them.
Right. And I'm Southern Baptist. I'm a lousy Baptist, but I am one. And so we would used to print the scripture passages in the little Sunday school booklet because people couldn't be trusted to bring their own Bible. And so they would do verses like 1 to 5 and 8 through 11, meaning that they didn't want to talk about 6 and 7.
Right. Yeah. No, I can see that. And I think when I'm teaching interpreting the Bible to PBA students, I kind of think all the time I'll get a question from class or I'll do something, find something in my reading and think this just looks like an exception, and that confuses us. So we're uncomfortable with it, and maybe it's okay to be uncomfortable with it because that's part of our cultural norms to be uncomfortable with exceptions. But then to be comfortable with the God who has ordained that exception.
So we have rules over relationships, and they have relationships over rules.
And the God we find in the Old Testament and the New Testament is relational. And so why wouldn't we find places where relationship overpowers the ritual. Or
So everybody listening knows the story of Rahab, the harlot, that sort of thing. But we don't point out she's a Canaanite and she gets land.
right. Yeah.
The first story.
She's that exception in Joshua.
Yeah, and then the next one is Achan, the Israelite, who doesn't get land. And we know the stories, but we don't make any. And you know, my suspicion is the writer of that book is trying to say something. So the Israelites kill all the Canaanites, and they're still everywhere. So the Pharaoh kills all of the Israelite boys, but it wasn't a group of women who left on
Right.
the Exodus.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Moses'
and the nation
brother.
continued to grow.
Yeah,
Yeah. Wow.
Mm.
Good.
yeah. Sorry. So
No,
what?
don't
No, this
apologize.
is
So,
good.
so what question were we doing? What were we talking about?
We were talking about no. We started with the question of what you've brought back from Indonesia. What do you feel like has shaped your?
Right. Well, I've been thinking about it a long time. So I wrote this book basically about things that I brought to the text. But over time, I kept thinking, and the place that really got me thinking about it was the honor shame. That's very trendy these days.
Yeah.
Talk about honor and shame. And we always act like shame is the opposite of honor. And so honor is good, shame is bad, and it's wrong to shame people. Problem is, when I read the Bible, Paul shames people.
Right.
You know, Paul says, I write this to shame you. So, you know, so I wonder if he really means that. Well, he says, I'm writing this to shame you. Jesus shames people. He said he did this to shame those who were proud of this. And then God shames people, shames the wise. So you think, that's kind of tough. And actually, so I was scheduled to deliver a paper at Wheaton next month, but I'm not going. And it was on shaming as a biblical virtue. So what we have in the U.S. is the misuse of shame. And so what we see in the U.S. is all the bad kind of shaming that goes on. The purpose of shame was to say, be careful, you're about to cross a boundary, so don't. And our purpose of shaming is to tell somebody, you have crossed the boundary and there's no way back. But the purpose of shaming was to always, it was insider, so it's for us, and it's to draw us back toward the center. So most of the world uses shaming, and they use it in good ways. In fact, we're using it a little bit in our own culture. You know, if you get too close to people or you don't wear a mask in the grocery store, our culture will shame you into doing the right kind of behavior. The problem is, in general, we do it the wrong way. It's not done to restore. It's done to exclude or to push people out.
Could you give this is off the cuff, an example of how that sort of shepherding shame, if you want to call it that, plays out in like church discipline, for example?
In my new book, which is called Misreading Scripture with Individualist Eyes, our culture is individualist.
Yeah.
And so is the UK.
Yeah.
There's a spectrum from individualist cultures to what we call collectivist cultures. And there's a range. So it's interesting that it's a pretty consistent range all the way over to the other edge. And then there's two cultures that are 3 times more individualistic than anything else. So they're so far off the scale that you really can't put them on the scale. Those two cultures are the US and the UK. So we are not just individualistic. We're like crazy individualistic. And so if you did the whole scale, everybody else would look collectivist because, you know, we skew the scale so much.
Right.
So they generally just do the scale and then they do ... and then they put us out on the edge. So I tell the story of a pastor friend. He was in the Middle East. He said, I have a church member who has stolen a book from the library. And I said, oh, wow. He said, it's not a big deal. The book costs about $5. But I have to figure out how to restore him without losing him because he's one of us. And so so he talks about how he's going to go to lunch with the guy and say, someone has stolen a book from our library, and I sure hope he brings it back because otherwise the entire church could get the reputation as people who steal things, and that would be shaming for all of us. And of course, the next Sunday, the book was back. Now, the pastor knew he'd stole it. He knew he stole it, and he knew the pastor knew he stole it. But he did it in the most gentle way possible, which is what Matthew 18, the restoring of people, is doing. It's shaming in the least public way possible each time. You go privately. If you don't respond to that, then you go with another. So you keep upping the ante until it works. But the goal is to restore. Shaming done right is always to restore. Now, it's a bit like a chainsaw. You know, chainsaws cut. There's certain things that are just so much easier to do with a chainsaw. But there's a lot of people you don't want to give a chainsaw to. It's too crazy a tool. And so most people just need to leave it alone because they're just going to end up hurting themselves or someone else. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with shaming or the chainsaw. But, you know, it needs a great big handle with care. Let the experts do it.
I heard it said once that like counseling counseling done wrong is like giving a chainsaw to a toddler.
Yeah.
Is how they describe it. That in those most delicate situations, it can just.
So anyway, that got me thinking about collectivists. And so how are collectivists different from individualists? Well, you know, why should you care? Well, partly because the world's global. Your neighbor may now be a collectivist, you know. But also the Bible was written by collectivists for collectivists. And so besides being an individualist culture, we're what's called a low context culture, meaning we don't assume a lot of shared knowledge. Right. So when we tell a story, we add a lot of details. Most cultures are high context cultures, meaning they leave a lot of stuff out because they assume everybody knows that. And it went without being said. Well, the Bible was written to people in a high context culture. So sometimes when you read a story, it's like something is missing. Yes, it's because something is missing. And so they tell the story and they just expect you to know what's wrong or why this is right or wrong. So in the story of Abraham and Sarah, there's huge gaps missing because they expect everybody to know. In the story of Joseph and this coat of many colors, they expect you to know about inheritance laws, the fact that Joseph is the oldest son of the second wife. So when he gets the coat, Jacob is saying Joseph's line is going to inherit. His wife is going to be considered the official wife. Well, what about the other sons? They're out. They're going to rely upon the graciousness of the inheriting son. So you think, well, that's okay. They're brothers. But so they tell us a story where Joseph says, I had a dream where all the sheaves bowed down to me. Well, that pretty much tells them the way things are going to shake down. Right. And so they tell us all that stuff. They expect us to know why this matters. Now, these are adult sons with their own families. So, you know, what would you do to defend your wife and kids? Probably what they do.
Great lengths. Yeah. Yeah. And you'd certainly hold some resentment or grudge. Well, this has all been really helpful, Dr. Richards. I appreciate you taking the time and looking forward to misreading Scripture with individualist eyes.
Thanks.
When's it come out?
August.
Okay, good. All right. Well, we'll look out for the pre-order link, and we'll send it out to everyone when it's available.
All right, thanks.
That's great. Jordan, you want to close us out?
Great. I just want to say thank you again. And thank you for tuning in. We hope you and your families are well. And we look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon. Thank you, Dr. Richards.
Thank you. Thank you.